Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our third installment of the winter webinar series, Greening Your Grounds. This one is brought to you by Imagine McGregor, LTVCA Stewardship, and the Sunrise Rotary Club. We are hosting this series in order to engage people throughout our watershed who may be concerned about conservation and who want to help. This webinar specifically is for any homeowner, whether living in the city or in the country. Anyone can implement these practices. We will begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of First Nations people who have a long-standing relationship to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. We also acknowledge the local Lower Thames River watershed communities of this area, which include Munsee Delaware Nation, Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, Caldwell Nation, and Oneida Nation of the Thames. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original people of Turtle Island. We are thankful for the opportunity to live, learn, and share with mutual respect and appreciation. As you may or may not have heard in the past few webinars, the LTVCA is located in southwestern Ontario. It is one of 36 conservation authorities. We are the second half of the Thames River, and our watershed contains a total of 55 sub-watersheds, some of which drain into the Thames River and eventually Lake St. Clair, and the others drain directly into Lake Erie. Our region hosts prime agricultural land and is one of the most biodiverse regions of the country, the Carolinian Zone. As a reminder, the LTVCA Stewardship has funds available for buffers along waterways, tallgrass prairie, reforestation and wetland restoration projects, as well as cover crop subsidies for farmers. We also want to highlight our native tree sale that is on right now until March 1st. Details can be found at our website or by contacting us directly. This event has been organized within the department by a program called Imagine McGregor. McGregor Creek is a priority area with the sub-watershed meeting the Thames River in downtown Chatham. Due to the land use changes, we have lost the majority of our habitat, and this being in the Carolinian Zone is very significant for biodiversity. We also choose this area to focus on specifically because of the flooding associated with it and its connection to the city and the country. With this program, we hope to involve everyone in conservation in whatever capacity possible, which is why we are hosting this specific webinar. So these are the main objectives of Imagine McGregor. We want to work with community partners, get the message out into the community, get more native plants in the landscape, and increase resiliency, as well as empower the community to get involved. We want to allow people to imagine what McGregor Creek can be. Imagine McGregor has been made possible with the help of the Sunrise Chatham Rotary Club. This club is taking action to help the environment, and they realize one of the best ways to do this is through knowledge transfer. We want to encourage you to have a look at the website. It has more resources, and you can see examples of what clean water champions are doing around town. Hopefully, after this presentation, you'll be inspired to become a champion yourself by implementing some of these practices. So right now, I'm just going to show a quick video introducing the Clean Water for Living project.
Whether it's industry or residents or institutions, municipalities, we all have a role to play in protecting and respecting our water.
We belong to the human race, and this is the only planet that we have to live on, and therefore we need to do our part to conserve it.
We have 2 children, and we want our future generations to have access to clean drinking water. It needs to be looked after, it needs to be cared for.
If we can take the resources that we have, utilize them efficiently, produce healthy food for an ever-growing population, I think that should be our goal every day we get up and go to work.
I want to make sure that my soil is productive not only for myself today, but for future generations. With very little capital investment, most farmers already have the tools in their shed to get started. They look at the soil, they touch it, they see the activity of earthworms, they see these things that are tangible to the human eye. So that's what it's all about. Our focus is all driven by what our future generations are going to be left with.
We want everyone to be involved in protecting and respecting our water. Can there be a better legacy that we could leave for our grandchildren than clean water for them to live and play in?
Just a few housekeeping items before I pass it over. Please stay muted with your camera off for the duration of the presentation. There will be a Q&A at the end, so put any questions you have in the chat as we go and we'll answer them then. Reminder, if you haven't been able to pick up your booklet yet, there will be another chance to get it this Wednesday. Details are in the email about pickup. Please feel free to respond to that email with any booklet-related questions. Now I'll turn it over to Mike. Mike, are you able to introduce yourself a bit as I switch over the presentations?
Sure. Thanks, Anastasia. Hope everybody can see me here. I'm just going to turn my camera on for a second while I give my intro. My name is Mike Smith. I'm a graduate of the Environmental Management Program at Ridgetown campus of University of Guelph. I've lived in Chatham-Kent for just about a decade. I attended a Greening Your Grounds workshop in the summer of 2019 through LTVCA, and I learned about the importance of adding more native plants to the landscape. I subsequently sold my house in Chatham a couple years ago. I moved to the country and I've started a Facebook group called ReLeaf Chatham-Kent to track my progress of naturalizing my property. Happy to see that that now has nearly 1,000 members. It's turned into a great community resource for learning more about native plant gardening, and I'm very proud of that. Happy to be invited by LTVCA tonight to work through the Greening Your Grounds guide with everybody in this presentation. And once Anastasia has the slides up, we'll get going with that. Thanks. Awesome. Okay, so as I just mentioned, this presentation is intended to be an overview of the Greening Your Grounds guide. I'm going to put a little special focus on the importance of native plants. But if you haven't already picked up your guide, I highly recommend it. There's detailed step-by-step instructions and worksheets for all the projects in here. We don't really have time to dig into all the hows and tos for every little minute detail of all the projects. So this is intended to be an overview. Next slide, please. Okay, so why are we talking about greening your grounds, or what's the importance of this? So the image there is Lake St. Clair, and as Anastasia mentioned, the Thames River flows directly into that water body. Sedimentation is a growing issue in our lakes and rivers, which that image demonstrates pretty clearly. And that demonstrates the image there demonstrates the extent of the problem. Nutrient loading has negative impacts for endangered wildlife like freshwater mussels in the river, but also for water treatment plant intakes potentially impacted by algae blooms. So the summer of 2014, Toledo, Ohio was impacted by an algae bloom caused by cyanobacteria that shut down the water treatment system for thousands of people for quite a few days, actually. And the water was not safe to touch, let alone drink. So that's a major issue that impacts everybody. We've also got a lot of flooding, as Anastasia mentioned, from higher intensity storm events. And municipal stormwater systems can't handle those 100-year storms, and they're costly to upgrade and maintain. So what can we do? Well, we can think about changing the way we think about stormwater. So focus on slowing down flows and allowing for infiltration back into the water table, rather than thinking about trying to just get it off our property as quickly as possible. And this can be especially important in rural areas that rely on well water, which of course much of Chatham-Kent does. Next slide, please. All right, so changes to the water cycle. I really love this image here. I think it demonstrates pretty clearly what's happened. But in the natural water cycle, we have very little runoff over land to receiving bodies like streams, rivers, and lakes. Deep-rooted native plants and trees increased infiltration rates, held soil in place, and they also helped to transpire moisture back into the atmosphere through their leaves. This also resulted in more predictable and less extreme precipitation. In the urban water cycle, much of the water that falls on a given area obviously hits an impervious surface like a parking lot or a roof. picks up a bunch of pollutants like fertilizers or gasoline, and then it's quickly deposited via that municipal stormwater infrastructure into the same rivers and lakes that we pull our drinking water from. Just want to highlight that statistic at the bottom there, that 70% of the pollutants that enter the Great Lakes enter them through runoff, which is from the US Environmental Protection Agency. So obviously that's a big problem that's not going to be solved by one single action alone, but I personally like the quotes, do what you can with what you have, and know better, do better. So hopefully this will help everybody know a little better about what we can do about this. Next slide. So I've mentioned stormwater a number of times now, but I wanted to talk just a little bit about what exactly we mean by stormwater. So stormwater, the technical definition, is water from rain or melting snow that does not soak into the ground. So it runs over rooftops and paved areas, bare soil, and even your conventional lawn, typically, and depends on how much rain, right? As it flows, it picks up and transports all that fun stuff that's listed there. So we've got pet waste and sediment, which is obviously the big problem in the river, pesticides, fertilizer, de-icing, road salt. And on the right-hand side, I've got a few facts about stormwater that you may or may not be aware of. I mentioned the rural residents relying on wells, so less infiltration is obviously a big problem. In just about every urban area built before 1990, stormwater flows pretty much untreated right to a receiving stream. And many areas in Chatham, in the city of Chatham, are still connected to combined sewers, which carry both sanitary and storm. So during wet weather, the amount of water in combined sewers going to that treatment plant may exceed capacity and end up in sewage overflows to the rivers and lakes, obviously, again, contributing to algae blooms and things like that. So infrastructure costs to move and treat stormwater are rising, and several cities in North America are considering changing the way they calculate stormwater user fees. So it would be going to a system that would be based on impermeable area found on your property. And an example in Ontario is the city of Barrie is actually in public consultations to move in this direction. Next slide, please. So if you had the book, I've tried to color code my agenda and my slides a little bit to match along, to go along with the guide, but this is just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to go through rain barrels and rain gardens, Soakaways, permeable pavement, and how to connect all of those things together to sort of manage stormwater in a more holistic way on your property. Next slide. Anastasia talked about the guide being developed by the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. It was developed about almost a decade ago now, 2013. And it was created to promote low impact and natural landscaping as local adaptations to address climate change. Locally, of course, funded by LTVCA and the Sunrise Rotary Club. Next slide. So the first little bit of the book basically encourages you to get out a sheet of graph paper and start with a site assessment, which I would agree with very, very highly. So I like to start with a sketch of the entire property, and that'll allow you to consider important aspects such as your property lines, your proximity to buildings or underground utilities, existing drainage, and approximate your impermeable areas. And one of the most important steps that you need to do right off the hop is calculate your slopes. So in the book, I believe it's page 7, they talk about how to calculate slope. I won't get into too much of the nitty-gritty details, but basically you need to measure slope at every downspout, and it needs to be less than 5% for any of this to work effectively. So as you can imagine, probably everybody already has the land around their basement, around their house, sloping away from the basement, which would be good. But if you don't, the book will teach you how to fix that and help you calculate it as well. The seasonal water table also plays a very important role in this whole equation. So if the groundwater rises to within 3 meters of the surface, then the TRCA and everybody else would recommend that you not continue with any of the projects in this guide. So basically, if you're already flooding all the time, it's not really a good opportunity for your property. The other very important initial step that you're going to want to do is a soil infiltration test. So that will help you determine what kind of soil that you have, and it's described on page 8 and 9 of the guide. And if I could get the next slide, please. Here we have a soil map of Chatham-Kent. And as you can see here, much of Chatham-Kent is clay soil. So that needs to be considered as part of your design for a rain garden. If your infiltration test has indicated poor draining soil, which would be 16 to 24 hours of time to drain, you would need to amend your soil with a sand or compost mix to increase the infiltration rate. So soils in blue here on the map are high in clay. So that's a good chunk of us, including me, North Buxton here. And the yellow and orange areas are lucky to have more sand or loam content in the soil. So they would be a little bit quicker draining, and you might not have to do too terribly much to integrate a rain garden into your landscaping. Next slide. So here's where I'm going to take my only sort of diversion from the guide. There is a couple of pages in the guide that talk about plants. But for me anyway, plants are the backbone of any good landscape design. So anyone that attended Doug Tallamy's presentation as part of this webinar series will be very familiar with the concept of native plants. But for those that did not, native keystone plants basically have the highest impact for biodiversity and wildlife support. So in Chatham-Kent, the plants with the highest impact are native oak trees, willow trees, and the plums and cherry family. And I will talk a little bit more about some of the reasons for that. Next slide. So what are native plants? Again, if you didn't attend Doug Tallamy's presentation, and this is new to you, what are native plants and what makes them different from non-native plants? Sorry. And for me, the most important concept here to understand is coevolution. So these relationships in nature are all around us and constantly changing and have been evolving for thousands of years in most cases. And in the image there, we see a few of the different relationships and interactions taking place between plants and insects and fungi, bacteria, viruses, parasites. And here's an example of that concept at work. So hummingbirds and the flowers that they pollinate, for example. The longer the beak of a hummingbird, the more food it will get and be able to reach. And the further away the food is in the flower structure, the better chance the flower gets pollinated. So the plant comes to rely on the hummingbird for pollination, and the hummingbird is one of the few species that's able to access that specific food source. Another good example would be insects eating plant leaves that trigger the plant to release an attractant chemical that recruits specific wasps to come and parasitize the caterpillars. So many plants and insects have evolved to be dependent on each other like this. So like monarchs and milkweed are one that everybody's familiar with. And these complex relationships take a long time to develop. Native plants have been here and adapted to our ecosystem for thousands of years. And in the case of those keystone plants that I mentioned, like the oaks and willows, asters and goldenrod, there may be 400 different species of butterflies and moss that could feed on those leaves. And they depend on those leaves being present to feed their caterpillars. Next slide. So the following list of keystone plants should make up as much of our landscaping choices as possible if we want to have maximum wildlife support. So these plants have co-evolved relationships with hundreds of different caterpillar species, which is of course the basis for the food web. Most birds require thousands of caterpillars to raise their young, and they won't establish nests in areas without proper food resources, which is another shout out to Dr. Tallamy for that research as well. So if you want to see birds, butterflies, and bees, you have to plant native species. In the list here, I've tried to narrow this down to which species and how many are native to Chatham-Kent. So we've got 8 native oaks, we've got 10 native willows, and if anybody's interested in that specific species list, I could send that out after the presentation. Next slide. So this example here is from the guide, and it's really great because it shows a number of connected systems. So if you look in sort of the top middle left there, you'll see that they do have a rain barrel. And then probably that whole gravel filled area is very likely an infiltration trench, which is connected to their rain garden. So This is obviously so much better in so many ways for supporting wildlife and also for infiltrating stormwater than if this little patch was just lawn and someone had to just push the lawnmower for 6 trips up there every Saturday afternoon. Next slide. So when a raindrop falls, we ideally want it to land on something green and something deep rooted and then slowly soak in back into the water table. And on most urban properties, this isn't possible because a good percentage of the area is either roof or driveway or shed or patio or a hard surface. And in most new construction, downspouts are hooked directly into the storm sewer connection in the front yard by default. So you're discharging all the stormwater off of your roof directly into the storm drain. So the first step for any of this stuff is to disconnect your downspouts. So you would need to remove the plug and cap. You'd want to install downspout extensions and splash guards. And you want to direct the water into a rain barrel or other infiltration project. And I'm just going to highlight again here that you really want to consider slope when you're doing this. Once you've disconnected your downspout, obviously that water is still going to go somewhere, and where it's going to go is down. So you want to make sure that everything is sloping away from your basement. So that goes back to as well to ensuring that downspout extensions are installed properly and they're not leaking where they're connected. And you want to keep any outlets of this water away, about 5 meters away from structures, and further is better. So don't neglect slope issues and regrade if necessary would be my highlights from this slide. Next slide, please. So rain barrels, I think everybody's probably familiar with what a rain barrel is, but it's a great resource for collecting rainwater, obviously, which itself is a great resource that most of us simply let flow off into the street. It's much better for watering garden plants, and almost half of our summer water usage is typically outdoors. So either watering the lawn or watering your planters or whatever you're doing. And again, I just like to highlight, make sure the outlet of your barrel doesn't slope towards a structure. If you're overwintering your barrel, make sure your downspout extensions are reinstalled and directed away from the basement. And I will point out here on this slide that LTVCA is planning to do a rain barrel fundraiser this spring. So if you don't have a rain barrel already, stay tuned, and there will be details forthcoming about how to get one locally. Next slide. So rain gardens. Personally, I think these are the most obviously aesthetically pleasing way to deal with stormwater. A rain garden design can be as unique or as simple as you want it to be, but the basics are an inlet from your downspout, a shallow dugout depression, usually where the soil has been amended to increase infiltration, unless you're one of those lucky people that lives in an area that doesn't need it. You'll also probably berm the soil up around the dugout depression to keep the water in place. And you're also going to want to have an outlet to direct any overflow where you want it to go. So when looking at the cross section of the garden that's on the slide there, you're going to have areas of various moisture levels ranging from moist and high in organic matter at the lowest point to dry and airy up on the tops of the berms. So this is a perfect opportunity to introduce a wide diversity of native plants. Rain garden sizing and the need for various soil amendments are going to vary greatly on your goals and the amount of impermeable area that you're going to direct into the garden. So going through the workbook and doing the worksheets that are available are going to help you determine how big you need to make your rain garden or how big you can make your rain garden. And amendments can include sand, small gravel, compost, leaf litter, or topsoil. I just want to note here, it's not on the slide, but rain gardens should never be placed within 4 meters of a septic system because their purpose is essentially the same thing, which is putting water into the ground. And a properly designed rain garden does not have any pooling water within 24 hours of a rain event. So that's an important consideration, as many local bylaws, including here in Chatham-Kent, prohibit any kind of standing water. So you need to make sure that however much soil you remove and amend, it's going to infiltrate within 24 hours, which again, if you've designed it properly based on the way the guidebook lays out, that shouldn't be an issue at all. Next slide. So plant selection for rain gardens, because rain garden design and conditions can vary so widely, there can be a huge number of potentially suitable plants. So the list that I've given there, the 6 half dozen, they're generally quite hardy and easy to grow, and they would do well as the backbone of a plant selection list for any rain garden. But you can certainly seek out, there are shrubs that would be happy to sit with wet feet most of the time. So you're certainly not limited to those 6 plants, and I encourage you to join the ReLeaf group and do some of your own research about, what plants might work and which ones wouldn't. And then I've just got a couple of points there about clustering and layering, which are 2 landscape design techniques that you can apply to make your design look more natural or aesthetically pleasing. So single specimen plantings obviously don't have as much wildlife impact as clustered and multi-layered options around your rain garden. Next slide. So both rain gardens and soakaways are designed to allow water to soak into the ground. And the main difference here is that rain gardens are filled with a sand and compost mix, and soakaways, either pits, which are pictured on the slide there, or infiltration trenches, which are on the next slide, are filled with a coarse stone mix. So they're designed to get that water into the ground quickly. A soakaway can have a top layer of soil and added plants, but their main advantage is that they can fit in very small or narrow spaces, whereas rain gardens usually require more space. So these soakaways won't function if they're clogged up with leaves or soil. So you do need to sort of keep them clear. And it does require a fair amount of digging to reach the appropriate depth. Next slide. So an infiltration trench is a linear soakaway. So similar to a French drain, if you're familiar with that, but the pipe that's used to convey the water is perforated. So that allows it to soak in as it travels, and that makes it an excellent option for strips of land along driveways. I know in the place that we used to have, there was a perfect spot for one. And with any of the above projects, so soakaways, infiltration trench for sure, rain garden maybe, depends on how deep you're going to dig. But it's important to remember to call for locates before you start digging. And I would even propose doing it as part of your planning process, because knowing the locations of those underground utilities are going to inform proper placement of any of these infiltration projects. And the guidebook is full of detailed installation instructions and worksheets, and they talk about how deep to dig and what kind of gravel to order and all that kind of stuff. Next slide, please. Permeable pavement. So as previously discussed, over 50% of the rainwater that falls on a suburban neighborhood lands on a hard surface. And I don't know about your property, but at my old house, much of that area was driveway and parking area. So permeable pavement is a great way to deal with that runoff. And it comes in a ton of different styles and varieties, some of which I've tried to picture here. And depending on what you use, it can reduce runoff by 30 to 100%. Next slide. So a bit here about just how to install those permeable pavers and what kind of layers and things that you're going to need. So there's 5 layers to this. The first one would be the soil base, and you need to dig down to approximately 1/2 meter. You want a flat but not compacted surface, so you certainly don't want to tamp it down too much, because compaction is going to reduce its ability to absorb water. Then you'd need a sub base consisting of the largest size gravel that you're going to use in this project like this, approximately 50 millimeters. And in clay soils, like many of us have in Chatham-Kent, you'd also put your under drain here, which is the pipe that you see in the picture. The next layer is called a base layer, and it's smaller gravel than the 50 mil down to 20 millimeter, followed by another layer of gravel, which is what you actually set your stone into, and that gravel would be about 5 millimeters, very fine crushed stone. And then you'd set your permeable pavers into all of that. So the thing that I would highlight here is all of the gravel that you need for these projects needs to be what they call clean fill. So it's been rinsed of any smaller sediment pieces, because those would clog up the ability for it to drain properly, which obviously is a key component of this working effectively. Next slide. So all the projects in the guide can be used as building blocks, and you can totally be creative with incorporating various infiltration projects into your overall landscape design. So the top one there, obviously kind of complicated, but not really when you think about it. Disconnect your downspout. You've got a couple of rain barrels that are connected together. Those rain barrels would outlet into an infiltration trench that would go however long you want it to go, and that would outlet into a rain garden. But it can be as simple as you're going to disconnect your downspout, you're going to drop the entire thing into a soakaway pit and be done with it. So there's lots of different ways that you can go with this, and I think the guide's a great resource for trying to figure out what would work for your specific area. Next slide. A couple more visual examples here of a low impact design or a stormwater management project. So obviously reducing the amount of lawn that you have in any fashion is a great first step. But these two examples here show a more integrated approach to managing stormwater effectively. So most of that gravel area would be infiltration trench. There's that depression at the bottom that would be a rain garden. And probably in both cases, if they've done it correctly, there's also an outlet to the street or to the gutter for anything that does manage to get through all of that infiltration and get overflowing the rain garden. Next slide. If you are looking for a local example, our very own LTVCA office property was designed with many of these concepts in mind. So all of their parking lot runoff, it's not permeable pavement, but all of the parking lot runoff is captured into 3 bioswales, which are filled with liners and engineered substrate designed to filter the water. So it's designed to handle specific flows of that parking lot and then outlet to the adjacent park and then into the Thames. They put in 45 different native plant species. They were able to obviously reduce the amount of grass that they've mowed. I personally think it looks great. So we've got improved aesthetics. Visited by monarchs, red admirals, warblers. They still need to do regular mulching and weeding, but I would say much preferable and many more benefits than just grass. Next slide. So a bit about local resources. I talked in my introduction quickly about ReLeaf Chatham-Kent. That's a Facebook group that I started to help people learn and organize about this kind of stuff. Our little tagline up there is a place to learn, organize, and develop strategies for increasing natural area in Chatham-Kent by promoting the sharing and propagation of native plants and trees. We have almost 1,000 people now that are into this stuff, so please bring us your questions. It's a very active group. You'll get an answer almost right away. And we do have regular contest events and great discussion. I've got some contact info there as well. If you want to jump on Instagram or shoot me an email, you can do that at those addresses there. Next slide. Another great resource would be SFN, or the Sydenham Field Naturalists. Their website is listed there. SFN is Chatham-Kent's only naturalist club. They are a registered nonprofit. They do great tours, awesome education. They have great monthly meeting speakers, and their annual native plant sale is an awesome local source for plugs for your planting project. Next slide. And speaking of planting projects, Anastasia mentioned the tree sale. Both of our awesome conservation authorities in Chatham-Kent have a tree sale annually. I believe St. Clair Region's tree sale is going on as well. They both have knowledgeable staff that would be happy to help you implement a project like this. And they also host awesome educational events. And that pretty much brings us to the last slide, which would be questions. If anybody has any, I would be happy to take them now. Thank you.
All right, so we have a question from Tim. He asked, what's a good alternative to a plastic rain barrel? Would a used whiskey barrel work?
Yeah, certainly. Anything that holds water, really. I've seen lots of different things and lots of different contraptions used for sure. The one thing that you want to make sure is that you're able to clean it effectively, just because it does have water sitting in it most of the year, right? And so you want to be able to rinse it out typically annually. But if that's not a problem, then yeah, anything that holds water and can be easily moved around would be great.
Kelly would like you to send the lists when the presentation's over, so we'll make sure to do that.
Yes, absolutely. No, for sure. I've got it on hand so I can get it out quickly.
Perfect. Yeah, so far we don't have any more questions. I'm scrolling through. I don't seem to see any more. Wait a couple minutes.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to hang out for a bit if anybody's typing.
Marley asks, where could I get a couple of whiskey barrels?
Excellent question. Actually, I mean, for aesthetics, obviously they'd look great rather than the plastic rain barrel, right? So if anybody's got a source, I mean, maybe that's a business idea for somebody right there. Rain barrels out of whiskey barrels.
Lawrence asks, what is the reason for limiting standing water?
So I'd have to dig into the bylaw specifically, but it's around the property standards bylaws usually in most cities. And usually the reasons are typically mosquito based, right? Or, you know, West Nile issues. So typically there are bylaws in most places that would limit, you know, having like a kid's pool full of water if someone called and complained. So that would fall into this category, even though it's, you know, been designed as a landscape feature. If you haven't done it properly and there's water sitting in it for longer than 24 hours, then as the current bylaws are written, then yes, it would be a violation.
Alex had asked about the gift card draw, and I can answer that one real quick. We're hosting one more webinar, and after the final webinar, they're going to figure out who's all attended and do the draw for the gift card. So that's pending. Just waiting to see if there's any more questions that'll pop up. Who's speaking at the next one? So that will be, we have it partially confirmed with Sam Whiteeye in collaboration with the Carolina in Canada. So it's right now it's called Where It All Began, but we're looking to get more details on that in the next couple weeks, getting that posted and getting that advertised a bit more. So Lawrence Grant asked, I have a pond, but I also have a water garden, but water during big storm can last several days. Looks like to be a violation, but the birds love the water. And
yeah,
I'm not
so
sure.
one of the ways that you, I mean, I think most people probably get around that is I'm pretty sure the Chatham-Kent bylaw anyway has a stipulation about having moving water or having it aerated. So if you had a pump or a filter or a waterfall of some kind, then your landscaped pond would be fine. What the bylaw usually specifically applies to is like just still standing water. So if you've got a waterfall or a pump or anything like that, you're probably good.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike.
No problem.
Trish asked, what about having a pond? I'm thinking she's referring to wetlands.
Yeah, or could be she
Or
maybe
like a
going
larger
back to
pond.
the yeah. Also obviously super effective and a great way to manage a huge amount of stormwater if you had a spot for it, for sure.
He asked about picking up a book. Yeah, if you just email the Imagine McGregor, like respond to the Eventbrite emails, we can figure out a way to get you the books. Yes, and sorry about the sound. We will be posting the recording of this on YouTube. Joanne asked, is there an organization or person who would be available for consultation and advice?
Definitely your local conservation authority. If you haven't already reached out to them, that's where I would start with something like this.
For sure.
That would be my starting point. I'm sure that they would probably be able to recommend specific resources. I'm not sure that there would be a specific landscape company that's going to focus on this, but if you brought them the idea, I'm sure that most would understand what you wanted to do. So
exactly. And I know the Imagine McGregor project is looking to help out with more projects like this kind of low impact development type stuff in the future. So there may even be funds available in the future, depending on where the project goes. Lawrence also asked, where does the Upper Thames and Lower Thames Authority boundary exist? Lower Thames actually goes up all the way up to Delaware. So there's even a little bit of London that's considered Lower Thames Conservation Authority. So Dunwich, which Lawrence lives in, would be included in the Lower Thames. Keep on putting those questions in. If anybody else has any more questions, we're here to chat. So. Where can we email about the book? If you respond to the Eventbrite email, or here, I'll type it in the chat so you could copy it easier. Any advice on how to get rid of garlic mustard?
Not specifically, other than it will very likely be a years-long process. The Ontario Invasive Plant Management Council has some really good resources on managing invasive plants, which obviously garlic mustard is. One of the best things you can do is snip the seed heads off of it, but obviously that's not practical on a large scale. So it depends on how much you're dealing with.
One thing, garlic mustard is actually edible, and I guess it makes a pretty good pesto. I haven't tried it yet, but you can eat it too.
I've heard the same thing, and I have also not tried it, but it's on my list because why not eat it if we need to get rid of it, right?
Exactly. What about Japanese knotweed? Any advice on that one?
That one, from my understanding, having not dealt with it personally, is one of the very worst invasive plants that we have in the province right now. So if you do have knotweed, I would certainly recommend contacting your conservation authority to let them know that you have it. You can also report it through a number of different online reporting invasive plant management systems. And again, I'd refer you back to the Ontario Ontario Invasive Plant Management Center. Maybe I can email about that as well, because they do have sort of management guidelines for most invasive plants like Phragmites and things like that. So Japanese knotweed, I'm not familiar if there's a specific management plan for it, but that would be the place to start.
Marley said, "Hi, Lawrence. Sounds like as if you spend a lot of time weeding," and I think we all do. It's fair. Well, if there's no more questions, maybe we'll wrap up for the night. If you have any more questions that you think of afterwards, feel free to email us. You have the Imagine McGregor email there, and Mike provided some of his contact. If do we want to put that in the chat as well? Mike, are you able to type that in
Sure,
the chat?
Perfect. Yep. So that's my email address. Anybody would like to email me any questions or anything like that, I'd be happy to chat. And of course, I encourage you to join the Facebook group if you're on Facebook. Lots of helpful, happy people that are really eager to help more people get into this stuff. So come and join us.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And we will be sending out